Hi, my name is Adam Whitmer. I'm the founder and host here at ComplianceCohort.com. This compliance clip is going to talk about redisclosing the closing disclosure. Specifically, we could take a look at this question. It says, if there is a change to the disclosed terms after the creditor provides the initial closing disclosure, is the creditor required to ensure the consumer receives a corrected closing disclosure at least 3 business days before consummation? So we understand that the closing disclosure has to be provided 3 business days before closing, but if we have something that changes, do we have to give a new closing disclosure 3 business days before we can close, pushing back our closing date? So the answer, of course, to this is going to come from Regulation Z 1026.19. And also we can take a look at the frequently asked question under the Truth in Lending RESPA frequently asked questions number 1 under the section of corrected closing disclosures and the 3 business day waiting period before consummation. So let's take a look at this frequently asked question number 1 because it explains it quite well. Then we'll dive a bit into the regulation itself to give you a citation on where this rule is coming from. So frequently asked question number 1 says this. It says, it depends on the type of change. So we're asking, do we need to have a new 3-day waiting period? Well, the answer is it depends on the type of change. As discussed below, so that's in the frequently asked question, it says there are 3 types of changes that require a creditor to ensure that the consumer receives a corrected closing disclosure at least 3 business days before consummation. For other types of changes, a creditor is not required to ensure that the consumer receives a corrected closing disclosure at least 3 business days before consummation, but is required to ensure that the consumer receives a corrected closing disclosure at or before consummation. So the answer here, the question is, do we have to wait 3 business days? How do we correct a closing disclosure when something has changed after we issued it? Well, there's 2 answers to that. It's either we just provide a corrected one at closing, or we potentially, if we have one of 3 things that's referenced here, we may have to wait an additional 3 days before we can close. So that's essentially our answer. Now let's take a look at the regulation and see where all of this lays in the regulation and Regulation Z. If we look at 1026.19 F1 2A, this is the general requirement that says a creditor must ensure that a consumer receives an initial closing disclosure no later than 3 business days before consummation. So this is the initial closing disclosure. Now, if something changes, we could take a look at 2 other parts to Regulation Z. The first part is 1026.19 F2.1. And what this says is, if the disclosed terms changed after the creditor has provided the initial closing disclosure to the consumer, the creditor must ensure that the consumer receives a corrected closing disclosure at or before consummation. So for most changes, you could just provide an updated closing disclosure at the time of closing. That's what this is saying. However, as our frequently asked question number 1 said, there are 3 things that do trigger a new 3-day waiting period. And this is actually found in 1026.19 F2.2. And there are 3 types of changes that do require a creditor to provide a corrected closing disclosure at least 3 business days before consummation or before closing the loan. And these 3 things include, number 1, a change that results in the APR becoming inaccurate. So the APR is inaccurate when it moves more than 0.125 or 0.25, depending on the type of transaction it is. So if the APR becomes inaccurate, you would have to provide a new closing disclosure and wait 3 business days before consummation. The second thing that would require a new closing disclosure in a 3-day waiting period is if the loan product information required to be disclosed under the TRID rule has become inaccurate. So if you change the loan product, you have to provide a new closing disclosure and wait a new 3-day waiting period. And then finally, if you add a prepayment penalty, that is also going to trigger a new 3-day waiting period after you provide an updated and corrected closing disclosure. So other than these 3 things, you don't have to wait 3 days. You can just provide the updated closing disclosure at the time of closing, assuming you provided an initial closing disclosure 3 days before the initial closing. Now that's all I have for you for this compliance clip. If you're interested, we have a bunch of free training videos just like this. If you're new to the compliance cohort, check us out. We have a basic membership that's absolutely free, a bunch of videos and articles and other resources that you can take a look at. We have discounts and giveaways and a Friday newsletter, all of that for our basic members. Now, if you're an existing member, you know in our store, we have premium training available at compliancecohort.com/store. Now, that's all I have for you. So thank you for watching to the end. You're the reason we do what we do, and we hope you have a compliance-filled day. Thanks so much.